Good morning. We're today interviewing Patrick Gnazzo. Pat, would you spell your name?
Patrick-Gnazzo.
And tell us a little bit about your present affiliation.
Well, presently I have a company called Better Business Practices LLC. It's a consulting business dealing with business ethics and corporations.
Great. How did you get involved in business ethics?
Well, originally I was involved as the Associate General Counsel at United Technologies Corporation, and I was responsible for compliance, which was government contract compliance, the federal acquisition regulations. And compliance is a big piece of doing business with the federal government. And back around the 1985-86 timeframe, there was a lot of concern with respect to the illegal activities of corporations, and that in effect they weren't following the compliance requirements of the Department of Defense and other organizations within the federal government. And so we were heavily involved in making sure, and I was heavily involved in making sure, that UTC was being compliant when they were doing business with the federal government. That compliance generated into a period when the government was claiming the corporations were committing fraud, waste, and abuse, and corporations had to, in effect, answer those questions with respect to fraud, waste, and abuse by coming up with compliance programs, code of conduct, having somebody responsible for the compliance program, making sure that they do investigations when they do something wrong, making voluntary disclosures. And I just gravitated from being the Associate General Counsel at UTC for government contract to the Associate General Counsel for compliance.
So is this something you sought out, something you said, boy, I want to be the compliance guy, or how did that actually happen at UTC?
The CEO walked down to my office and said he had a conversation with Jack Welch, who was the CEO of General Electric, and said we ought to do something to, in effect, convince the Department of Defense, the government, and individuals in the country that they were not, that companies like UTC were not cheating. And so he wanted somebody to carry that kind of water with respect to the compliance program. And since I was associated with government contracting, I was anointed. I didn't have a chance. I didn't get to volunteer. I was just anointed.
You've made a career of this, though.
Since then, I've made a career of it, because what happened was all of the government contractors got together and they formed an organization called the Defense Industry Initiatives. And those contractors all signed up to having a compliance program, having code of conduct, having a hotline for employees to bring things to the attention of the company without fear of retribution. We signed up to doing training, we signed up to doing investigations, and we signed up to committing to discipline actions when we find that people were doing something illegal or incorrect with respect to the compliance program. In order to be able to do this, we were in effect writing on a blank slate. And so these companies got together as the Defense Industry Initiatives to help each other. We came up with ways of being able to share best practices. And so once a year, we would have a best practice forum, and we would take the best of whatever other companies were doing, share that so that we could all use some of those best practices in our own organizations.
So you mentioned GE, and of course you were with UTC. How many organizations were involved in the Defense Industry Initiative?
I think originally it was 60 companies. I mean, the names are names that we all know: Lockheed Martin, Boeing, General Dynamics, Raytheon. Some companies that no longer exist today because they've merged with other companies, like Sunstrand, for example, became part of Hamilton Sunstrand and then UTC. Rockwell Collins is now part of UTC. So a lot of companies that originally were formed in that group of 60, I think they now still have about 120 companies that are involved, smaller companies. But these were the major defense contractors. We had the top 10 defense contractors as part of DII, and we had a majority of the other defense contractors that joined the Defense Industry Initiatives.
You talked about convincing other individuals in the country that this was going to be a good idea and help rehabilitate reputations, I guess. Can you talk a little bit about these other individuals
Sure.
in the country?
I tell a story all the time about the fact that I was born and raised in Pittsburgh and very close to my mother, and I worked in the government for 10 years, and so I was the chief trial attorney for the Navy. And she was very proud of the fact that I worked for the government. When all of this fraud, waste, and abuse was being publicized in all the newspapers, it made it into the Pittsburgh Press and the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, and my mother called me up one day and said, "Are you a crook because you work for a defense contractor?" That really hit me in a very, very strange way, that just guilt by reputation, guilt without us being able to explain what we were doing and how we were doing it, that we were being associated with fraud, waste, and abuse everywhere we went. And that had a real impact on me, my career, and my life, because I wanted to make sure that we were able to change that reputation so that my kids could be proud of the fact that I worked for a defense contractor and that I was actually doing something that made their life better.
I love that. So that was part of your motivation and part of your early goals. As you thought about this new responsibility that you had, what were some of your goals and objectives for the company, for yourself, for the people who worked with you?
You know, that's a great question, and I think about that all the time with respect to what my goals and objectives really are. I have always believed, when I went to UTC, United Technologies Corporation, that I was a business person. I was being hired to be a business lawyer, to give good legal advice so that the company could do the right thing with respect to how they dealt with the community and with the government. But in the role of being the compliance officer, I had to think long and hard about the fact that I had to have an impact. I couldn't just sit in my office and wait for people to come in and say to me, "Hey, I think there's a problem, can you work on it?" I had to, in effect, establish myself with management and with the employees as somebody who had this role to try to protect the interests of the corporation and try to protect the interests of the customer, try to protect the interests of the employees and the shareholders and the stakeholders. It was just a thought that said, I have a bigger role to play than just making sure that everybody's being compliant. In that role, I have to see myself, I have to be seen by management and by the employees, by the suppliers, as someone who they can talk to, who can make an impact in the company, who has a seat at the table, who is independent enough that I don't have a vested interest in making sure that I keep the legal department happy or the HR department happy or the IT department happy, but what I'm trying to do is make sure that we follow our goals, our mission, our stated mission. So in thinking about that, I found myself spending a lot more time walking around, talking to managers, talking to them about what they were doing and how they were doing it, and understanding compliance programs. Because originally, when I thought I was the chief compliance officer, that meant I was responsible for the company's compliance program, and I wasn't. I realized that every function in the company had a compliance responsibility. IT needed to make sure that there were no unauthorized software on anybody's computer. And HR needed to understand that they were following the statutory requirements for veterans preference, for anti-discrimination. All of those issues are compliance related, that the legal department had to be responsible for making sure that there were no antitrust issues or there were no money laundering problems in the company. And so my role evolved not to make sure that everybody was being compliant, but to make sure that corporation organizations, each one of the functions in the company understood what its role was with respect to compliance and that they were doing it. They were doing what they said they were supposed to do. So my role was actually oversight. Excuse me.
So you make it sound easy. You were out talking to people, convincing them that this is part of their responsibility, and they somehow had to tell you that they were in compliance. Was it easy? Were there challenges?
It wasn't easy, and there were challenges, but it was intriguing in the sense that I was a lawyer and I was doing government contract work prior to this, and so I knew the FARs and I knew what our obligations were with respect to government contracting. This new role taught me that I needed to understand what IT was all about, what HR's role was, and what they were doing. what the legal department's responsibilities were, what procurement was doing, understanding what the quality organization was going through and what they had to do, and then understanding what their outreach was with respect to the suppliers and what their outreach was with respect to employees, and their outreach with respect to the community, the environmental department, and understanding what the environmental department was trying to do with respect to safety and with respect to ground, air, and water and how to protect it for the community. It was intriguing in the sense that I was actually opening up my horizons in understanding what business was all about, not just we have a product and we're going to sell it to the U.S. government and we're going to follow all the rules and do the things that we need to do to make sure that our jet engines are the best jet engines and they go into those kinds of aircraft or the best helicopters, but understanding what made up that helicopter or what made up that jet engine and all of the functions that were necessary to make it work.
Were there any particular barriers to you accomplishing all of these objectives?
You know, back then the biggest barrier was HR, and I speak very, very fondly about HR, and the reason it was a barrier was because part of what we were all doing with respect to compliance programs was putting in these hotlines for employees to pick up the phone and call and to tell us what they thought was going wrong with the company. Well, unfortunately, during that period of time, HR throughout the country, throughout the U.S., was going through reductions in force, and they were downsizing HR organizations throughout the United States in major corporations, which limited the number of HR people from the good old days where you had HR people that had an office with a box of Kleenex and you could go in and say, my boss doesn't like me, I didn't get my performance evaluation, I don't have the right parking spot. And HR had the people that could actually manage those kinds of issues. As HR got downsized, they became much more of a business element in the sense that they were doing programs, they were doing performance evaluation programs and rating programs and making decisions on leadership involvement with respect to who, leadership movement within the corporation. And there was less time for people to be sitting around and answering the questions of why my boss doesn't like me and how to fix that. So employees started using the hotline for those issues. And so that was never the intent of the hotline. The intent of the hotline was to tell us that somebody was committing an illegal act. So a good 80% or 90% of the calls that we would get were HR related, and we had to pass them on to HR. But we also had an obligation to make sure that HR was going to act on it. And therefore, we were an overlay. We were looking over their shoulder and saying, but did you answer that question about the performance evaluation? Did you answer that question about their boss being a bully? And HR didn't like having that overlay, and it was understandable. But for us, if we didn't follow up on those questions, they would never call us for the real issues, the real illegal activity. So that friction existed for a long period of time. I think it's gone now, but it took a while for HR to understand that we were not trying to do their job, but that we were using a helpline or a hotline or a whatever you want to call that line for people to use, that some of those issues were HR related, but they had to be answered and responded to. And we had to keep tabs to make sure that we followed through, or we would never get those phone calls.
Did you experience that challenge with any other departments?
Yeah, but we experienced the friction with the law department. Besides the HR department, obviously the law department saw itself as being the compliance piece of what a company's function is. And they saw it because they had a heavy piece of compliance with respect to antitrust and money laundering and fraud. And therefore they thought that the chief ethics officer or the chief compliance officer was somewhat encroaching upon what they were doing. Now it helped that a lot of us ethics officers or compliance officers were lawyers, but a lot of us weren't. And therefore there was a heavy friction between whether the chief compliance officer should report to the law department or should report somewhere else in the organization. That friction, I think, still exists today. And part of the reason why it exists today is back in 1991 when the Sentencing Commission came out, the whole goal of the Sentencing Commission had to do with criminal activity because it was built around criminal activity. And they established the need for compliance programs for companies beyond the government contract companies, the commercial companies, the pharmaceuticals, the companies that were manufacturing cars, and any number of other types of businesses. And they called it compliance, and because it was compliance, but it was compliance with rules and regulations. And in effect, because it was criminal activity, the law department saw itself as the organization that was most responsible for managing that compliance. The friction occurred because the law department didn't understand that, yes, they were responsible for managing fraud, and they were responsible for managing antitrust, and they were responsible for managing all of the kind of legal activities, but they didn't want to look over the shoulders of HR, and they didn't want to look over the shoulders of IT, and they didn't want to look over the shoulders of the procurement organization. Who was going to do that? And that's the real reason why there was a chief compliance officer. That friction still exists because lawyers like to manage the compliance organization because they see that as their major goal. It's not. They are just a function that has some compliance activity within the function, but the rest of the company also has compliance activity.
We're talking about compliance because that was what you were involved in. Some people call this compliance and ethics, some call it ethics and compliance, some just call it ethics. Talk about that particular labeling of this activity in which you have been involved.
Sure, it gravitated over time to becoming more important to be an ethics officer than to be a compliance officer. And the way I describe it is, you can have a compliance program and not have to have an ethics program, but you can't have an ethics program without a compliance program. And what I mean by that is, every company has to have a compliance program. They have to follow the statutes, the rules, and the regulations. They put out policies and they demand that their employees follow those policies. That's a compliance program. And so I don't think you can exist as an organization, as a business, as a government, as any entity without a compliance program. The next step is to say, reputationally, who do we want to be? How do we want to be perceived? How do we want the street to think about us? How do we want, just like those CEOs were worried when everybody was talking about fraud, waste, and abuse, they wanted to be perceived as a company that was a partner with the U.S. government, not a hindrance to the U.S. government. So how do companies want to be perceived? How does an organization want to be perceived? Do they want to be known as the environmental company that is destroying the environment? Or do they want to be known as the company that never cares about charitable organizations or volunteerism? Do they want to be known about a company that doesn't have any concept of their community and being a part of the community? That's all part of the kind of the mantra of this is who we are. This is how we want to be perceived. When you add that element into it, you're really adding an element of ethics, business ethics, not ethics as everybody knows it as good and bad, but ethics in the sense of this is who we are and this is how we want to be perceived. We make a jet engine and we put safety into it. We make a jet engine and we make it fuel efficient so that we save money for people when they're using it. We make it so you feel good about the fact that you're getting on that airplane and it's going to be safe and that it goes up when it's supposed to and comes down when it's supposed to. The same thing with what you do with your elevators and your air conditioners. You want people to feel good about that particular company. And the minute a company does something wrong, that's the time they say the company is not ethical. They don't talk about the fact that the company is not compliant. They talk about it being ethical because the mantra is, are they a good company and do they do what they say they're going to do?
So you've talked a little bit about some of the initial startup challenges and how you have thought about them and ways that you tried to address them. Would you say that you were able to accomplish all of your early objectives, or are there still some big issues or things that have been undone, not yet done?
You know, I used to argue that the job was something like rolling a pencil uphill with your nose. You could do it and you'll get to the top of the hill, but it's a slow process. And because part of the process is teaching constantly, talking to managers, and managers change. So today you have a great procurement officer who really wants to be ethical and wants his people to do the ethical thing. And the procurement officer changes and they bring in a procurement officer from another company. And it's reteaching, re-talking about what the goals and objectives of the company are, what its core values are. And in that constant change causes you to always feel like you've just taken 2 steps back and you're now going to have to take 2 more steps, 3 more steps to accomplish something. The other thing is that because everything moves very, very fast, technology takes over. And with respect to technology, you're trying to bring all of the elements to play with respect to making sure the employees know what the right thing to do is, what the managers know what the right thing to do is, what the company's goals and objectives are. And you're trying to use the best technology possible in order to do that. Well, I mean, we spent years and years putting training programs together with talking heads, and they were wasted over time because the talking heads, I mean, over time the talking heads became old and the law changed and you had to revamp it. So you were constantly finding new ways to train people. It was probably one of the biggest frustrations I had in my career, was finding ways to get individuals to want to sit down for 60 minutes or for 30 minutes and think about their job and think about the things that they were supposed to do correctly, and making that training at least exciting enough that they're willing to sit down and do it and not kind of roll through the training very, very quickly and answer the questions and hope that they got it right intuitively.
That's an eternal challenge, probably one that still exists today, right?
Absolutely. Training is probably one of the hardest things that an ethics and compliance officer has as one of their responsibilities, because none of us are educators in that sense, and therefore we need the talent of educators to help us get the message across correctly. We're not subject matter experts on everything, so we need subject matter experts to help us with procurement and with IT issues and with HR issues, and so we have to bring the subject matter experts like safety people into the mix. And then we're not technologists, and so we have to have people like our cameraman sitting over here who are going to help us be able to deliver the message the best way so that it's visually something that people want to watch and listen to and are attracted to enough to actually accomplish the purpose of getting the message across. If you think about it this way, how many times have you gone on an airplane and the steward or the stewardess has given you instructions on where the exit doors are and where the exit windows are and where the lighting is and everything? And if you walk off the plane and you say, okay, you just got off a 737, where are those exits? I don't remember. And you're still being instructed time and time again. And the real thought process is, at least I know there are exit doors and I'm going to look around really fast if something goes wrong. But knowing exactly where those doors are, we just never will remember that from plane to plane, from configuration to configuration.
So in addition to the training challenge, what challenges remain for the ethics and compliance community?
Well, that's a really great question with respect to the challenges. I think the biggest challenge for the ethics officer, for the compliance officer, is establishing the function so that it stays with organizations forever. You know, every company knows that it needs an HR function, and every company knows that it needs some legal function, or at least tie itself to a law firm so that they get advice depending upon the size of the company. Every company, if they're doing contracting, know that they need a procurement function and they need a function that deals with suppliers. It's not yet readily understood in my mind that every company understands that they need a compliance officer or an ethics officer, because there's always this thought, well, the law department can do it, or the HR department can do it, and we find in many instances where people are double-hatted with respect to the function. And so we're not there yet that says every company really understands that it needs a single function within the company that's a compliance and ethics function. I worry about that because I've seen so many functions of ethics and compliance in corporations get disbanded when a new CEO comes in or a new new leader comes into the company and they don't understand the function, and then the function either finds itself down in the basement, which is where we are right now, or they move the individual so far away from the C-suite, from the people that actually have an impact. And so I think that's the biggest challenge, is to convince business and organizations, whether it's the United Way or the State Department or the Pentagon, that they need an ethics officer and they need an ethics function that has employees in it as part of it and has a budget and has a responsibility to ensure that all of the other compliance functions in the company are doing things that are compliant and ethical.
So do you have a view on where this person or this function ought to report?
Yeah, I have a view, but I'm always thwarted by other people who argue that, hey, let's be very, very real with respect to the fact that CEOs cannot have 15 people reporting to them. We all know that, and as a business person, I know that. And so you know the CEO has to have the CFO reporting to him, and you know that the CEO should have the HR person reporting to them, and they should have the General Counsel reporting to them. Those are three functions that really should be reporting to the CEO. There are others like strategic planning, obviously, and treasury and other functions that probably could sit under another function within the company. The problem I'm having with respect to saying that the Chief Ethics and Compliance Officer should report to the CEO is I do understand business and I do understand the complications of having too many people that are part of the CEO's responsibility. So I'm of a mind that says, give me a leadership organizational structure that allows me to be administratively, as the ethics and compliance officer, administratively under somebody, whether it's the General Counsel or the COO or the Chief Administrative Officer, somebody, but administratively, not somebody who is functionally over me. I need the independence of being able to speak to the board whenever I need to. I need the independence to be able to go into the CEO's office anytime I need to, or the CFO's office anytime I need to. And so I don't need the permission of the General Counsel or the Chief Administrative Officer or the COO to do my job. I need them to help me manage my budget, and I may need them to help me manage my staff and the size of my staff. I may need them to help me argue where my office should sit, whether it's sitting in the C-suite or not. But I need to be able to have that kind of mobility and independence to be able to go wherever I need to go. And so I would argue that whoever you report to within a corporation or within the corporation structure, it should be an administrative reporting responsibility, even to the CEO, because you want to be talking to the board whenever you need to, and you don't have to go to the CEO to go talk to the board. And so it should be an administrative overlay rather than a functional overlay.
So you talked a little bit about your time at UTC, and a moment ago you mentioned that you had a management role. Was that at UTC? Was it somewhere else? Talk about your experiences in different organizations that help you come to this view.
Sure. When I was the Chief Compliance Officer for UTC, even before I was the Chief Ethics Officer, I was also the Vice President of Contracts, which meant that in a company of 200,000 employees and 7 major divisions, we had contracting functions in all of those divisions, and so we had maybe 400 contracting individuals. So that was part of my management responsibilities in making sure that they were trained properly, that we had the right mix of talent, and that we had the right mix of capabilities with respect to doing their job. And so I was a manager, in addition to being responsible for ethics and compliance. I moved from that function to another company when I retired from UTC to Computer Associates. And at Computer Associates, in addition to being the Chief Ethics and Compliance Officer, I eventually became the Chief Risk Officer. So I managed the function of the risk organization and was responsible for the organization's risk mitigation process. After that, when I left the Chief Ethics and Compliance Officer there, I became the General Manager of Computer Associates software business with the federal government, which was about a $500 million business. And so I sat on the other side of the table managing salespeople and procurement people and financial people and even legal people as the general manager. And so, I mean, it fit with my role of being a business person and understanding business. In between all of that, I was president of United Technologies International for a period of time. So I was the company's spokesman, and I ran the international organizations for UTC for 3 or 4 years, which really gave me a much better view of being the chief ethics officer, because in understanding of those organizations that we had in 180 countries, I was managing offices in Beijing and Riyadh and in Rome. So in effect, I was understanding the company's international business by being president of UTI. I also, for a period of time, was the VP of Government Relations for UTC. So I was the chief lobbyist for the company. And to be able to be this chief lobbyist and go in to talk to a congressman or a senator or a secretary of defense, you needed to understand the company. You needed to understand what the company was doing and what its function was and what it was able to produce. And so all of those experiences really helped me in understanding the kind of core values that a company is trying to place out there when they're doing business. So I've had a lot of business experience, and then when I left Computer Associates, I started my own business and had to be responsible for IT, which I really missed the IT department very, very quickly, and I missed my admin very, very quickly, and so I learned to be my own admin, I learned to be my own IT department, and it really comes home to roost how important all the other functions are in making a good organization work.
Pat, talk to us a little bit about how you convey a company's core values and ethical and compliance expectations in a global setting. You talked about 180 countries with UTC, Computer Associates, global. What do you think needs to be done? How can it be done? How can it effectively be done as you try to communicate core values around the world?
Well, you know, when you're talking about core values, you're talking about how they impact various stakeholders. And so when you're approaching, let's use as an example, when you're approaching a country like Thailand that is buying maybe your helicopters, or they're buying your elevators, or they're buying your air conditioners, you would think that maybe just the core value of quality would be enough. It's a quality product. But you really understand that not only as quality product, but you understand that you have to be able to show that the company has good safety with respect to its equipment, and that when we're selling it to their people and to their communities, that it's a safe product. And then you begin to realize that you really need to be able to show in your core values that you care about their community. So you don't want to pollute the ground, air, and the water, and you want them to think that you're a good corporate citizen. So do you let your employees become volunteers to do things like Habitat or Special Olympics, so that they become part of the community and that people understand that, wow, Otis really, gets really heavily involved in Special Olympics and they really make the community better? Or Carrier spends a lot of time with the symphony orchestra to make sure that the arts are being properly funded so that the people can actually utilize it. So in those core values, you begin to realize that you have a lot of stakeholders, in addition to worrying about your shareholders and making sure that there's a good investment on their money, that they're getting a return on that investment. That's part of your core values, and that your employees feel good about coming to work. So it's the big picture. It's sitting back and saying, we're not just selling you elevators, we're selling you United Technologies Corporation. We're not just selling you air conditioners, we're selling you Carrier, or we're selling you Otis, and that means something. That means that our employees will be involved in your community, and we're going to protect your community, and our product is safe, and you're going to get a return on your investment, and we're here for the long term. We're not here to just make a quick buck and get out of town. Those are the kind of core values that you really want people to understand, rather than just, hey, we have an elevator and it's cheaper than somebody else's.
So you mentioned Thailand as you started that story. It strikes me that the communication you're describing could apply in any country.
Everywhere.
So Was there anything challenging in particular about bringing the common message to different cultures?
Absolutely. When I was, and that was the lesson I learned when I was president of United Technologies International, because we used to put books together. We called them country books, because we didn't want our ugly American employees to go into a country and not know what was their product, what did they manufacture, what was that country's what was its politics like, and what was its demographics and their geography. And so we wanted people to be able to go into that country and understand what was difficult about their life in that country and what we could actually do to make that life better. Part of what we did at UTC, obviously, is when we were selling helicopters or jet engines, people wanted to, the government wanted ability for their people to actually learn manufacturing. And so we had to give a piece of ourselves to a lot of companies, a lot of countries that didn't have strong manufacturing. And so we had to teach people how to make burner cans, or how to make condensers, or how to make any number of other things so that they could participate with UTC. And so it was much more complicated than just going in and selling in a particular country. You had to understand the country's needs. And in many instances, those countries would say, yeah, we'll buy your jet engines, but we make these gloves. Can you help us sell the gloves? Or we make oranges. We grow oranges. Can you help us sell those oranges somewhere else? You in effect understand that in each country they have their needs, and you wanting to sell to them, those needs have to be thought about, and they have to be helped with respect to how you're going to manage your life with those particular countries.
So let's talk a minute about something that comes up in a lot of ethics and compliance programs, comes up in a lot of countries around the world, the issue of bribery and corruption. This seems to be a kind of eternal issue.
I'm against it.
You're against bribery and corruption, okay. Is that a difficult challenge for US-based companies as they go into countries? I know people think it is. Is it actually something that presented a barrier to implementing effective ethics and compliance programs in various countries around the world?
Bribery and
or in the US too.
Yeah, bribery and corruption is something that exists everywhere. It exists in a higher degree in some places where countries are more lawless, but even it exists in the United States. We've had so many examples in the United States where corruption has occurred even within a company. I still remember an incident that we had in one of my companies where a hotline call where an individual said, "You do know that my manager in my little area in Indiana makes us go over to his house and help him build his porch with materials that are coming from the company." I mean, that corrupt purpose is an individual thing, but that's in the United States, and it's in the heartlands of our country. So yes, we see bribery and corruption at very low levels and at very high levels. So when Lockheed Martin talked about the fact that they were trying to sell jet engines or airframes in Egypt, they were talking to the president of Egypt, who wanted them to participate in some of the land that he owned. And so they told that story later on, that they found themselves in that kind of a difficult situation. When GE was trying to sell jet engines to Israel, they had to deal with a corrupt procurement officer, and in that, Rami Dotan. And so Rami Dotan wanted them to help him build little businesses to his own advantage in other parts of the world. When GE found out that their people were participating in that, they were surprised. I don't know how we can be surprised when we understand that individuals throughout the world may have a corrupt purpose, and therefore good, strong compliance programs and good, strong, open communication in an organization is what stops something like that from happening. Because in big corporate crimes, one individual can't do it by themselves. They do it with a whole bunch of other people as part of the system. And those people have to have an outlet where they can pick up the phone and say, "My boss is asking me to do something. I think it's wrong. Can you help me?"
Pat, as you look back on your career, can you talk to us about accomplishments, aspects of your career, your activities as an ethics and compliance professional, of which you are most proud?
There was an incident when I left UTC and I went to Computer Associates. Now, if you know anything about Computer Associates, it got itself into trouble because of the 35-day month. In effect, if the street said they were going to have $200 million in contracts for a quarter and they didn't, they would backdate October 1st contracts, October 2nd, until they got the 200. And so they might backdate 3 or 4 or 5 days of contracting. Now, you know, on one hand, it wasn't an end run in the sense that, excuse me, it wasn't an end run in the sense that it didn't really have something and it told the street a lie. What it really did was it had the contracts, but it told the street a lie about when it had the contracts. So they did that for about 11 quarters, and eventually the government found out about it, and a lot of people went to jail, including the top 16 officers in the company. So when I came in, I came in with a bunch of new people who all understood that this company had gotten itself into trouble and that this company really had to fix itself because, excuse me, it had to fix itself because morale was bad. The employees didn't feel good about itself, about the company. The street didn't feel good about Computer Associates. And so we had to do some things. And so, sorry, we got a lot of people together and we came up with core values, a mission statement. And so everything was going very, very well. We had a chief ethics and compliance officer who had a seat at the table. I was sitting up in the C-suite. I had a monitor because we had a deferred prosecution agreement, and so everybody was doing the right thing. Walked into work one day. I will never forget this. It was on March 15th of that year, and our fiscal year ended March 30th. And so we were coming close to the end of our fiscal year, and the General Counsel said to me, the CFO and the CCO, wanted to see me and the General Counsel. And so we went down to their office and we sat there and they said, look, we're not going to make our numbers at the end of the year, 15 days. So what we're proposing to do is that we are going to, in effect, haircut all of the salespeople. I mean, this is a software company that lives on the sale of software, and we gave really heavy commissions to our salespeople. And so I asked the question, how can you do that? I mean, this is March 15th. The contract says that we have a right to change the commission structure. I said, okay. So I went down to the law department and I asked to see the contracts. And I read the contract, and it was very clear to me that what it read was we have the ability to change commission structure in advance of a sale, not after a sale. Not after the sale has occurred. This is March 15th. The sales have already occurred. The commission is to be paid on the contract as it was originally written. So I went back up and I said, you can't do that. And they said, we talked to the General Counsel. I believed we had a weak General Counsel, unfortunately, but we talked to the General Counsel and he said it was okay. Now, in some jurisdictions, it might have worked in some states, but I knew that this was not the right thing to do. So from a legal perspective, I knew there was a problem. But from an ethics perspective, on March 15th, to say to people that you're not going to get the commission that we had originally contracted with was wrong. Now, the CEO wasn't around at the time. He was on vacation. And so I sat down at my desk and I wrote an email to the CEO, who was in the Bahamas. And I said in there that I thought this was wrong. I included a lot of other people on the email because I felt that if I was going to go down, people at least were going to know why I went down. And so I wrote the email and I said, it's not ethical. It may be legal in some jurisdictions. I think it's not in a lot of jurisdictions, but I don't think it's ethical. I got home that night and I got a call from the CEO who said, Pat, I got your email. I was assured that this was okay. I'm concerned, obviously. I'd like you to sit down with the COO and the General Counsel and the CFO and revisit this and get back to me. Well, I went back down and the next day and we revisited it, and I pushed, and they admitted that, yeah, this was a problem. And so we didn't do it. And we didn't make our numbers, and we had to do a restatement. And that was a big thing for a company that had gotten itself into trouble and that now had gotten itself out of trouble and now did it again. And in effect, we had to do a restatement from the prior quarter because we knew we weren't going to meet our numbers. And this was going to be the way we were going to tell the street that we made the numbers. So that was a very telling experience because the CFO and the COO said to the General Counsel, why can't you control your Chief Ethics and Compliance Officer? When I brought this to everybody's attention, and his answer was very, very telling, and I'll never forget this, is I can't, he's independent. And I was independent. So the long and the short of it was every executive in the company, senior executive in the company, did not get their incentive compensation at the end of that year because we didn't make our numbers. I was the only executive that got, as I see, incentive compensation because I stepped forward. Now, I have to honestly tell you, I don't know how many ethics officers can do that because it's career ending. Fortunately, I was old enough that I could walk out the door and it not be a problem. Fortunately, the board of directors did the right thing and did what was the right thing to do and, in effect, changed the numbers and made sure that we did the restatement. They might not have done that, and they might have walked me out the door. And so for me, that was a really telling moment. And I'll never forget the negatives that I got from some people, but the positives from the sales force. I was a champion for the salespeople because I stopped them from taking their incentive compensation, their commission. And that felt good. And I felt good that I kept the company out of trouble. And the company did its restatement and it rebounded and it did fine.
And that's quite an accomplishment, and it does take both backbone and the ability.
Yep.
Right, the confidence.
And my boss wasn't supportive, which was tough because I reported to the General Counsel.
Aha. And does that impact your view about where the ethics officer ought to report?
It only impacted in the sense that when I took the job, I demanded that it be an administrative reporting requirement and that I have direct access to the board and to the CEO, and everybody agreed. So even though I reported to somebody who didn't support me, I was able to get to the CEO on my own, and I was able to get to the board on my own. And so that was the nature of how I see a good chief ethics and compliance officer should be, is to have that access and to be independent enough to be able to override whatever their superior doesn't want them to do. When I asked my boss to join in on me with my email, his answer was, I don't want to be part of a revolution.
So Pat, you've talked now about your employment with UTC and with Computer Associates. You've now, in your current role, served as a compliance monitor for other companies. Yep. Where you have a whole different kind of relationship with the company, with the board of directors, with the external enforcement agencies. Can you talk a little bit about how that may have changed your perspective or affected the kinds of pieces of advice you give to the companies for which you serve as a monitor?
I think the best way to describe being a monitor, if you've ever gone to somebody's house, you've been invited to somebody's house as a guest, and you go into their bathroom and you want to open their medicine cabinet just to see what their medicine cabinet looks like, you know, what kind of medicines they're taking or what kind of things they use. It's intriguing. You know you shouldn't be doing it because it doesn't belong to you. It's not yours. And you really shouldn't be opening their medicine cabinet, but you do it anyway. Going in as a monitor to a company is going in and actually looking at, from a distance, looking at how a company operates. And you're looking at their bathroom. You're looking at, you know, what's clean about it and what's not so clean about it. And you're looking at it from a totally different perspective because it's not your bathroom. And so you can leave it someday. It's not your product, and so you're not going to be held accountable for what goes wrong with that product. It's a different function. And so It was a great experience. The couple of things that I would say that are really important for any monitor, for anybody to ever become a monitor, is I knew manufacturing and I knew software and I knew government contracting. Those were my expertise. I didn't know oil and gas. And so because I was the monitor for BP, I had to learn oil and gas. And so when I was asked by the Justice Department, how are you going to start your job? My first answer was, I'm going to spend 6 months understanding oil and gas before I do anything. And then I'm going to spend another 3 months understanding how oil and gas relates to their compliance program before I do anything. And then I'm going to hopefully be able to make recommendations very early on in the program so that I can watch them do those things over time. And what I don't want to do is every year while I'm the monitor, give them new things that they have to do, because that's just going to stymie everything that they're going to try to accomplish. Because if they're doing one thing that I told them they should do because I think it's the right thing to do, and then I tell them another thing and another thing and another thing, it's going to complicate the process. So a good monitor really needs, within the first year, to lay the groundwork for the things that they think should be done, and then spend the rest of the time watching them get done so that they get accomplished. Because if you don't do that and you make recommendations in the last year of your monitorship, you'll never know whether they're ever going to be implemented. So the experience was maybe threefold. One is learning a new business, understanding how the company operated, and then making business recommendations that work for that company's culture. So what I didn't want to do is say, well, the way we did it at Computer Associates was, the way we did it at UTC was. I wanted to be able to make recommendations that would work for their culture, the culture of oil and gas, the culture of refineries, the culture for how they were doing their broker-dealer business. All of those things had to be taken into consideration in saying, well, you ought to do this kind of training, or you ought to have this kind of a compliance program, or you ought to have this kind of helpline. It has to fit the culture. And so you need to spend time understanding the culture. And that means you need to spend time in their bathroom.
So do you think those recommendations stick? Your monitorship was how long?
My monitorship for the Justice Department for the remedial order was 3 years. There was also an administrative agreement with EPA, and that was 5 years, so they overlapped. And so I was there for 5 years. And yes, over a 5-year period, it's really hard to kind of mask not doing things and not doing the right things for somebody who's there and can walk around and talk to people and talk to management and look at helpline calls. It's really hard to kind of fool somebody. Maybe you can fool them for a year, but for 5 years, it's pretty tough. And BP really stepped up, and I have to honestly say I was very, very proud, one, to be their monitor, but two, more importantly, proud of the way they dealt with it. I had such a great working relationship with the CEO and with the senior management team that there were times, and I tell this all the time, and I said this to the CEO and to the board of directors when I left, was there were times early on that I wanted to meet with the CEO and I wanted to meet with the business unit leaders and the CFO and the head of HR. But there were other times that I came to London just to be a part of a meeting. They would have an ethics and compliance committee meeting, and I would just go for the meeting. And they would say, who do you want to see? And I go, I don't need to see anybody, I'm just going for the meeting. And before I know it, my schedule would be completely full with the CEO who said, oh, Pat's coming, I want to spend some time with him, and the CFO and the head of the oil and gas business, the head of the refinery business. They initiated sitting down with me and saying, so tell me what's going on. What are the bad things that you're seeing? What are the things that you're seeing? Excuse me. And so they took advantage of having a monitor and having an outsider's viewpoint rather than their own employees' viewpoint of things are going really great. We're doing really, really good things. And so they actually took advantage of having a monitor and talking to the monitor and wanting to make the company better.
Can you give an example of one big recommendation you made that they embraced and you would expect to continue over time?
I'll give you an example of something that I think they were surprised at. One of my recommendations was there needs to be a remit. There needs to be a statement that says what is the function of the ethics and compliance organization. And so they said, okay, we understand that we need to have a statement that says these are the roles and responsibilities of the ethics and compliance organization. So what should we put in it, Pat? And I said, I'm not going to tell you what to put in it, because then it's just going to be Pat's statement. And when Pat leaves, it's Pat's statement. This has got to be your decision. You, the chief ethics officer, have to sit down with management, and you have to sit down with the board, and you have to negotiate what you think the function is. You need to put it in writing, and I'll be happy to look at it after you've come up with your initial findings. But I'm not going to tell you you need to do this or you need to do that, because it's not going to be yours, it's going to be mine. And so I think they were a little taken aback by the fact that I wasn't willing to tell them what should be in that statement, even though we all agreed they needed to have a statement. But once they did it, and once they agreed on it, and they had management agree on it, and they had the board agree on it, it became their statement. And it's something that they really point to and say, this is our remit. This is what the ethics and compliance organization's function is. And now they don't have any dispute with HR or legal or IT or procurement or anything else with respect to their roles and responsibilities. But it was management's decision, and it was the board's decision as to what their role was. And that was challenging, but I think really beneficial in the long run.
Great example, thank you. So you've been in this business, we'll call it the ethics
Too
and
long.
compliance business. Let's call it more than 30 years, shall we?
Sure.
All right. So as you think about the early challenges and you think about the current remaining challenges, or maybe new challenges, can you talk a little bit about what some of the challenges were in the beginning and have we addressed them? And then what are the things that still remain for us to be done?
I think the biggest challenge early on was structurally putting a function together. What is the function? What's its purpose? What's its goal? How do you explain oversight and what the purpose of oversight is, and how big a staff do you need, and what kind of budget do you need? Because it's new. We've been doing HR for a long time. We've been doing legal for a long time. We've been doing procurement. We pretty much know what we need to do. What is it that we need to do with respect to establishing this function? So that was the early on challenge. The difficulty today, and the thing that's most difficult in my mind, is human nature and the proclivities of human nature. I talked in the other day about the fact that human beings were able to discover penicillin, and they're able to make jet engines and airframes to get people in the air, and communication is so much better today than it was years ago because of human beings and their intelligence. But human beings can also find shortcuts. They can also break rules. We constantly ask that question, how many people went past the speed limit today, even though, because they were catching up with everybody. So they had a level of what they're willing to break, what rules they're willing to break. How do you manage an organization that you set down the rules, the policies, and you say what's expected of them, and then make that organization work within the stress that occurs? Let's use as an example, you're making elevators and somebody else is making elevators, and you got to make it cheaper, you got to make it more efficient, you got to make it better. And so do you cheat a little bit? Are you going to be Volkswagen, and are you going to come up with a piece of software that's going to tell a lie with respect to emissions because it's going to be too expensive to do it another way, and your car's not going to sell as well as somebody else's because you've put more money into it? Those stresses occur, and those stresses exist. And I think the challenge today is being able to teach people that and teach management that they need to allow people to raise their hand and say, I see something, I have a problem. We've been watching on television day in and day out for the last month, 2 months, that we want to know who the whistleblower is in the U.S. government right now with respect to what's going on in the Ukraine. The issue is not who the whistleblower is. The issue is, what did the whistleblower bring forward? What are the facts? And if the facts are borne out, we don't need to know who the individual is that raised their hand. We need to know that the facts are not borne out or the facts are borne out, and we need to deal with the facts as they are. There is a tendency to say, let's kill the messenger. And we want to be in a position where today the challenge is to encourage the messenger to come forward and have a structure in place that can actually review what the messenger has said and either make a decision that the messenger was accurate or they didn't have enough information and they weren't accurate, and then fix the problem if it needs to be fixed. So getting human beings to believe that it's okay to raise your hand and say there's a problem and not attack the person that raised their hand, attack the issue, is probably the biggest challenge.
There are probably some in the ethics and compliance universe that would say, gee, that was an issue identified early on and we thought we solved that one. Yet your perspective is it remains as an issue.
Absolutely. It really does. We still hear it time and time again, and we're watching it play out on television. Who's the whistleblower? Who's the whistleblower? Where's the relevance to that? The relevance is, what did the whistleblower see or find, and is it true? And so if we're watching established politicians asking that question, why would you be surprised that the CFO wouldn't ask that question, or the CEO wouldn't ask that question, or the head of procurement and say, where did you get that information? Don't ask me where you got the information. Tell me whether the information is accurate or not. So we're still dealing with that. And when we still hear somebody say, who said that? Who are they? It's going to stymie the person raising their hand.
So it's November 2019, and we're still hearing the same questions that you heard when you were first tapped to be the compliance officer in 1986.
Absolutely. You're absolutely correct.
Okay.
And that to me tells me we're not there yet.
So there's still a future for this profession?
Oh, I think there's definitely a future for this profession. I worry that you've got to put people in that job that are not preachy, that are not they're not on a mission, that they're business people, that they understand business, that they understand and that they want to learn and understand what really is the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act and how does it work. And they really want to understand, what is it that we do with respect to procurement and how does it work, and what do we do with quality, and what are the things, the workarounds with respect to quality that can damage our reputation because it's cheaper to do something one way opposed to another way. What are the workarounds with respect to safety that can, somebody will lose their arm or lose their leg or lose their eyes. All of those things are so important. And so to take somebody who's 25 years old and say you're the chief ethics and compliance officer and put them down in the basement is not effective. To take somebody who used to be the president of a business unit or the general manager and say, I want you to be the ethics officer, they know what the bathroom looks like. They know what the medicine cabinet looks like. And they can be much more effective in being able to come out and say, why do you have drugs in your cabinet?
Pat, you've really done a wonderful job taking us through the history of ethics compliance from your perspective. You've talked about some of your accomplishments. I'm wondering, is there any place where you look back and say, ooh, I wish I had done this differently, or wow, that didn't work out the way that I thought, or gee, that just is still a problem and I failed to properly address it? Anything you want to reflect on?
I was asked that question. Yeah, I was asked that question about 15 years ago at a conference. I think it was a Compliance Week conference, and the moderator had me up on a table and said, and chairs and table, and said, what is it if you had to do it over again, what would you do differently? And I answered it one way, and I'll tell you what the answer is, and maybe I'm going to answer it a different way now. Back then I said, I really wish I had taken some accounting courses in college. I mean, I was a philosophy, political science major, and then a graduate of law school, but I didn't know enough about finance. And every time I hear about a problem, I just have to learn more and more about finance. So I had wished that in bringing to the job that I brought some financial skills to the job. Today, I would tell you that the most important thing I've learned is to be able to articulate the problem, to not be chicken little and coming in immediately saying, I just heard that we did X or we have Y. To be able to marshal your resources and your facts before you sit down and say, here's a problem. So that people see you as a trusted partner, not as somebody who's just constantly saying the sky is falling, constantly bringing negative news, constantly. When I was the VP for Government Relations, I had a congressman say to me one day when I went in to talk to them about something I needed. He said, you know, you people, me and the rest of my compadres in the lobbying world, come in whenever you need something, whenever there's a problem. You never come in and tell me the good things. You never tell me all the good things that you're doing in my district and the good things that are happening with respect to the company. You don't take that time, but you take the time to come in and tell me about a crisis, about a problem, something you need me to dig into. It would really be nice to know the good things. And so I would encourage every ethics officer to think in terms of being able, when they're telling the board and their management team about issues, that they're also telling them about all of the good things that are happening and that people raised their hand and we found a problem and we solved it. BP tells a story that is just so good that it needs to be told over and over again in all other companies, in all other locations. They tell a story about a mechanic in one of their at one of their airports that were managing some airplanes that were carrying fuel, and the pilot had called ahead and said, "I need to refuel the airplane. I need this kind of fuel," and the mechanic said, "That's the wrong kind of fuel for that plane." And he said, "Listen, I know what I'm doing. This is what I want." And the plane came in, and the mechanic refused to put that fuel in the plane. Within minutes of doing that, after being dressed down by the pilot recognized that he was talking about the wrong plane, and that had the mechanic done what he was supposed to do by order, that plane would have gone down and people would have died. And he stuck his hand up and said, "You're wrong, and I'm not going to do it." And he's now being touted in the company as a hero. And we need more of those heroes, and we need more of those stories, because employees need to feel comfortable at saying, what you're asking me to do is wrong, and I won't do it.
I love that story. One of the things that you talked about early on was the development of the Defense Industry Initiative and the best practice sharing. I know you've been involved in a couple of other organizations over time where best practice sharing was an important part of the remit for those organizations. The Ethics and Compliance Officer Association, the Ethics Officer Association, kind of the same thing, and perhaps others. What's the role that best practice sharing plays in the personal development of ethics and compliance officers, regardless of industry?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's a couple of things. One is, we all have this capacity of thinking that we know best, that we can fix our own problems, and we don't. I mean, we've got to come to that kind of fundamental idea that there are better ideas out there, and that you may not necessarily have invented those better ideas. Corporations and organizations have been very jealous about guarding their information, guarding what they do. The beauty of trying to establish a new function, where we're writing the rules as we go along, was that we didn't know what we were doing, and therefore any help you can get would be great. And so early on in our careers as pioneers back when, we were willing to share, which law departments were not necessarily willing to share with other law departments, and HR departments were not willing to share, and engineering departments were not willing to share because it was the family jewels. Well, because we didn't have any family jewels to share, to worry about, we were willing to share what we did and how we did it. I think that's become the mantra for the Ethics and Compliance Organization. And when you watch what happens at SECE or at ECI, At the Defense Industry Initiatives, you're seeing people say, we did this, and it may not work in your organization, but let me tell you about it. And we did this, and it may not work in your organization, but let me tell you about it. That kind of sharing, I think, has still kind of grown from the day it started back in the 1986 when it was called Best Practices Forum. That was the whole concept, is share your information, because we're starting from scratch. Because we're not an established function, we still need to share that information. We still need, I look on the SCCE website sometimes and I see people writing, does anybody have a policy on X or a policy on Y, or somebody, how are they handling social media, or somebody else asking the question of, how are you handling environmental issues with respect to compliance and ethics? How do you get involved with the environmental department? That kind of sharing of information is absolutely essential, because we're not an established function yet, in all seriousness. And I would hope that would continue over time.
That's great. One question about terminology, if you will. We've talked about ethics, we've talked about compliance, we've talked about compliance and ethics, we've talked about ethics and compliance, you talked about being involved in the risk organization, and we've had some conversations about the broad topic of sustainability. As you sort of reflect on your years in this field, what's the right word or words, terminology, and do these ideas fit nicely together, or is there another way to frame what you've spent your career doing?
I wish more companies would talk about their core values. I think that says it all, because the first question is, do you have core values? And the second question is, how are you managing your core values? And the third question is, did you really write your core values for all of your stakeholders? So do you have core values that help your shareholders and your employees and your customers and your suppliers, your community? I mean, do your core values touch all those? If you have core values that touch on all of those, and they work, those core values work for the product or for the service that you're providing, whether you're a not-for-profit or a for-profit or for the government, I honestly believe that you're going to be ethical, you're going to be compliant, you're going to have sustainability, you're going to do all the things that make a company great, besides having the best elevator or the best software or the best automobile. Because somebody else is going to make another better automobile, and somebody else is going to make another better elevator. But somebody else is not going to be you, Otis, you, BP, you, General Motors. And if you really care about that name, you care about your core values, everything else kind of falls into place.
Pat, I could just take all kinds of quotes out of this discussion today. They are really thoughtful and provocative recollections, and thank you very much for making all of these observations. I'm going to ask, you came in here to say a bunch of things today, you've said a bunch of things. What else do you want to share?
I guess the one message that I would really, really like to get across, and it's to universities, and since we're here at the University of Illinois, I'll say it out loud. There's too much emphasis in business schools on sustainability. I think sustainability is a really important part. There's not enough emphasis on core values, and not enough emphasis on teaching young people about asking the question when you go in for an employment, what are your core values? What is it that you think makes your company great? Don't tell me about, do you have a really good code and you have a really good chief ethics and compliance officer, or you have a really good environmental program. I mean, those are great, but just tell me about your core values. Tell me that you've thought it through and that you're doing things with respect to those core values. And I really wish that business schools would spend a little bit more time talking about core values than just sustainability, because sustainability is great. But sustainability is going to be different from company to company. What one company says with respect to, we don't use child labor, well, that's great, but when you're making jet engines, you don't use child labor. I mean, so it doesn't have a big impact. It does for a retail industry that, is making shoes or shirts or jackets. Yeah, using child labor is not a good thing. And so what one company's sustainability is going to be different than another company's sustainability, but the more important thing is what's the company's core values? What are they espousing? And do they espouse the same thing in the United States as they do in Malaysia or as they do in Saudi Arabia or any other country that they're going to do business in?
It's a great thought. It just makes me want to ask you what your core values are.
Wow, my core values. They've changed over time, obviously, because I'm old. But fundamentally, my core values are to make sure that my children and my family really understands their part in the community and their part in the family, and that they have an obligation with respect to that. It's important for us to, as a family unit, to understand we all have a role, and in that role we're all trying to accomplish something, and it's not us and them, it's us together to make that family unit better. And so I think a lot of the things that I do today really kind of try to concentrate on those in family core values of doing the right thing and being part of the community.
Does that translate into how people ought to view their jobs in companies?
Yes, it really does. So much of what we do in companies really depends upon the stress level, depends upon the competition, depends upon the economics of the country. When you have low unemployment, you're dealing with things differently than when you have high unemployment. When you have low unemployment, you're stressed because you can't fill jobs, and therefore you can't accomplish certain things. And so how you do workarounds with respect to the things that are happening economically, how you do workarounds when somebody comes up with a better mousetrap, how you do workarounds with respect to the fact that you don't have enough employees, or how you do workarounds with respect to a catastrophe that occurs or a crisis occurs. And we all went crazy with bird flu, and we all went crazy with, 2000 and, what was going to happen to the computers. And we all went crazy with hurricanes. How, does the company know how to marshal its resources in a positive way versus a negative way in overcoming those stresses and overcoming the competition and overcoming the financial hurdles and overcoming the cash flow problem and overcoming, the people problem? Are there positive ways that you can fix those things, and are there negative ways? And I think it's really important to constantly look at your core values and saying, are we doing it per our core values, or do our core values need to change?
Okay. Wow. What a wonderful discussion. Anything else you want to share?
I had a great time while I was here.
Well, it's been a lot of fun talking with you, Pat. Thank you so very much for being with us and sharing your views.
Thank you.